Hi guys, welcome back. What we are going to do now is we are going to discuss a little bit of the history of comic books. So, well, I say comic books, but I mean comic books and graphic novels. I'm going to break this up into two sections because there is quite a lot to go through again. And I do think it is more useful to have one section of theory and content and then a separate section after that. So the first thing that I want to talk about is what is a graphic novel and how is a graphic novel different from a comic book, and what is the history to this form of storytelling? So when we're looking at this section, I want you to keep in mind that most of the content I'm taking is from the Gregory Golder reading, which is in your Postmodernism 3B reading or reader, which is on page 3. So let's start. Before I start on graphic novels, I want to talk about comic books first. And the reason is that without comic books, graphic novels would not exist because they do predate them. They're kind of the family from which graphic novels came. So let's talk a little bit about where comic books come from and what they represent and what their ideologies are. So comic books came to the fore, or came primarily into being, during the 1920s and 30s of the sort of American boost in their economy. And they hit what is called the Golden Age during the 1938 to 1949 period. Something to keep in mind, although it is not necessarily right up at the front, but it is interesting to keep in mind, is that Vladek's story, the story we're reading about the survival of Auschwitz and World War II and the Holocaust, occurs during exactly this time period. So while the American comic book industry was seeing its big boost in sales and it became a recognizable genre on its own, at the same time, there was these truly horrific events occurring on another side of the world. So this is just sort of something to think about contemporarily. And something to think about importantly is when two things are happening at the same time in the world, though we might not think about them as being during the same years. Comic books of the time are very rudimentary if we look at them in their original sort of styles. And I'm going to take a look at the Superman here. I'm going to show you a picture of Superman later. But something to keep in mind is that although these characters are very sort of simple from the beginning, if we look at them, they are still present today. We still have versions of Superman in modern society. We still have Batman in a modern form. Think about how many reincarnations of the Joker, for example, we have recently had. Spider-Man has seen many different versions of himself portrayed and will see more in the future. And the X-Men is this ongoing series with characters that may shift and change, and sometimes we're focusing on different people, but the world has still existed for a very long time. Some of them, like Superman, is almost 100 years old at this time period. Now, when we're looking at comic books, something about them that is very different from graphic novels in reference to this specific idea is that although these comic books do shift with the times. So, for example, you will see that technology changes, events change. Sometimes the way characters behave in a circumstances will shift to be more aware of current issues. The characters themselves, a lot of the time, will not age, and there is something surprisingly timeless about these characters. And the whole genre has a sense of timelessness to it. Superman is still around. Batman shouldn't be, but still is around. Spider-Man is the same thing. These characters have been around for a very long time, and they're not showing any signs of technically being killed off. Now, obviously, I'm pretty sure the comic book nerds out there will tell me, oh, no, but this one died. I understand that, and I completely acknowledge. But overall, the manifestation and the idea of Superman is still around, and we will see future incarnations of him. And the likelihood is that these comic books with these different threads of these characters will still continue to exist. I know, for example, that there are many different storylines in which Superman exists. And in some, certain things happen, and in some different universes, other things happen. But the idea that Superman still exists today in our comic book industry is still very much there. And this is not the same in graphic novels. So when we get looking to graphic novels, we'll talk about how that is different. The next thing that we need to talk about here about graphic novels versus comic books is that comic books tend to reflect the social psyche of the people that are creating these comic books, but also the people that are consuming them. And in the original comic books that we see before World War II, there is a very strong sense of the American psyche of being a good, hardworking American person. What is social justice? What is right and wrong? And what it is to be a good person on a very simplistic, very clear black and white with no gray area section. And that is what the social psyche at the time was, is that this is the way people were, this is how we should behave, and comic books at the time tended to reflect that. And when you look at graphic novels, which is what we're going to talk about next, graphic novels tended to shift this. There was a massive shift in what a graphic novel was going to discuss versus a comic book. Now, comic books and graphic novels on a superficial level are very similar. And a lot of the time, if you speak to artists and if you watch some of the interviews that I have linked to you on the useful resources slides, you will find that a lot of the time an artist says, well, there isn't really a clear differentiation between them, which is good and well for us to look at from a simplistic level of the art. But if we're looking at it from the level of storytelling, there tends to be some slight differences. And the first thing to look at is that graphic novels tend to be a bit more traditional in the storytelling format they take. They tend to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So for example, if you look here at V for Vendetta, which I have in this corner, and Who's Watching the Watchmen with Rorschach in this corner, these two comic books have a beginning and then they have an end. They have some sort of conclusion to them, and sometimes that conclusion will actually close off that entire universe or close off the entire life of a set of characters. Whereas in a comic book like Superman, Superman still is ongoing, and there are universes in which he is still going on and doing new adventures. Whereas in a graphic novel, there will be a conclusion and there will be some sort of ending to this. Something to think about is how that is more prominent in a lot of the industry now. And a good example of this is there is a graphic novel called Saga, which was it is considered to be very, very popular. And it has won lots of awards, and it has run, I think it's full 11 or 12 volumes now, and it is now tying off and concluding, which shows that they have an arc that they want to follow, they have a storyline they want to conclude, and once they finish that, they will finish that series, and they will close off that world and those characters, whereas a comic book will not do that. So, in other words, think about this. When a TV series that is really good knows when to cut itself off, rather than just continue on indefinitely. I'm not saying comic books decrease in quality, but graphic novels tend to have a much shorter lifespan. Comic books are, and we talked about the ideology that supports them, graphic novels tend to be contrastingly more complex, and they deal with far more complex ideas like things involving rebellion, anarchy, corruption, social dissent, sometimes activism. They deal with some very complex ideas. If you look at, for example, Who Watches the Watchmen, or if you go and look at the series that is now being cast called The Boys, they both deal with the same idea. Who checks on our superheroes? Are they behaving the way a superhero should? Or is there some problems underlying this we need to hold them accountable for? That is a very complex idea, which introduces the idea that there might be a gray area when we look at people like our great heroes and how we perceive them. Lastly, we also tend to find that they be a little bit more mature in terms of the content that they deal with. Whether maturity is on a simple level, just they're allowed to swear and have violence, or whether they are trying to tackle concepts that require a mentality of an adult versus that of a teenager. Now, when we look at stereotypes, ideologies, and identities, a lot of the stuff shifted between World War II, or the end of World War II, or sorry, the end of World War I and the end of World War II. And there was a big shift in how we discuss concepts, stereotypes, ideologies, and identities. And comic books are a great way to track the way society has looked at different issues for a long period of time, just as literature is. This is just a more visual outcome. And one of the things to think about here is how this comparison that I'm going to draw now, how these things play out differently in not only comic books, but in literature in general. Now, I'm going to mention 4 things here, but there are much, much more that you can look at. So don't get stuck into these 4. But this is to give you an idea of how graphic novels after World War II would tell different stories and challenge ideas that before World War II comic books would never have discussed. So the first one, on a very simple, is that before World War II, superheroes needed superpowers. But after World War II, characters sometimes didn't need a superpower to be a hero. And sometimes it could be a very ordinary person doing something extraordinary. And that's exactly what MAUS is. It is not a superhero story. It is a story of a man surviving one of the toughest situations that a human could ever have been put in. He has no superpowers. All that he happens to have is be fairly educated and lucky a lot of the time, and maybe a little bit savvy in how he manages his situation. The next thing to look at is that before World War II, good was very clear. There was black and white, and that was it. Whereas post-World War II, there was a very big gap in which we went, oh, there is a gray area. Some people who might have been considered bad people because they were on one side have done some really good things. And some people who are on the good guy's side have done some really bad things. And there is a gray area. And importantly enough, and this is why I put these 2 characters here, you've got Superman, who's traditionally considered just the embodiment of goodness in the American all good guy, versus Deadpool, who is the strange uncle that you don't want to really invite around. There is the difference between this is a concept of good and evil that is very clear versus the character of Deadpool, who is not really a good guy, who does some awful, awful things, and is not somebody you would really want to associate with, but we like him and we root for him and we want him to succeed because he is the person we decided to stick behind. The next thing which ties into this is the ideas of morals and standards. Morals and standards, there is a set of justice, and justice is justice, and justice must be carried out. Whereas after World War II, there was a clear understanding that sometimes the justice system and the way that we have set up something like the justice system might fail us, and moral standards might not be the best thing for every person in society, and we need to question that at times. And World War II also wanted to look, after World War II, people wanted to look at characters that seemed more human. They seemed more real. Superman is Superman because he doesn't seem real. He can't possibly be that good. Deadpool, you can imagine very much being real because there are people out there that you've met that have characteristics that are like that. He seems tangible, which Superman does not. The last one I'm going to mention is not something that necessarily appears very strongly in MAUS, but it is definitely present overall in comic books, is the movement in the way women are portrayed. Now, women are portrayed before World War II in 2 ways, and sometimes still today. They are portrayed as either the good housewife, or they are portrayed as the motivation for a male character to do something. And what I mean by this is, a lot of the time, to get a male character to do something or to act, someone in his immediate circle needed to be hurt. And a lot of the time, it was a wife, a girlfriend, a daughter, a sister, or a mother. And a lot of the time, it would be quite horrific. These women would be put into a refrigerator. They would be murdered and then, like, served in some way, shape, or form that the male figure would come upon them and then use them as motivation. But the female figure themselves would have absolutely no autonomy to get themselves out of that situation in the first place. And what happened after World War II is when women started getting jobs and holding down the fort when the men were away fighting, these women were like, no, we have agency. We don't need to just be your motivation. You don't need to go protect us. We can do it ourselves. And if you are interested in that, there is an entire book called The Refrigerator Monologues by Catherine M. Valencia, where she discusses exactly this, and she goes through why women do not need to be the motivation to do things in literature. I'm going to end off here, which is on this slide, which is a really good little video talking about the differences between a graphic novel and a comic book. And when we come back, we are going to be discussing the differences and how artistically things are rendered in a comic book versus, or in a graphic novel versus how they are rendered in literature. Okay, I'll see you guys in the next video.